And so I would like to hand over to Kevin Kirkman from UKZN for our first presentation. He will be telling us about the work that has been done on the long-term trials at Ukulinga. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Good morning, ladies and gents. And it's a pleasure to be standing here speaking to you about an experiment that was started a long time before I was born. Probably not that long, but quite a while before I was born. And it will hopefully carry on for a long time after I'm no longer around. So Craig Morris and I have done a review of what's happened at Ukulinga, and we're going to give you a short overview of that. So in 1947, what's known as the AgFac was established at the University of, what was then the University of Natal. And it was done in a partnership with the Department of Agriculture, Agricultural Technical Services, as they were called then. And academic control was with the university, and financial control, or the finances, came from ATS. In 1948, Ukulinga Research Farm was bought for the price of a sort of a mid-range mountain bike. And in 1950, the burning and mowing trial and the veld fertilizer trial were initiated, with the burning and mowing trial shown at the top and the fertilizer trial shown at the bottom. And 1973 to 1976, the Department of Agriculture withdrew from the university and from supporting the AgFac. Everything went to the university, and a final report was written for the long-term trials because the future was uncertain and they were going to actually be stopped. But it's now 2025, 50 years after the final report was written, and the trials are still going. So what happened? It's important with long-term experiments to know what happened before they were started. And those experiments are located on a plateau at Ukulinga. The soils are quite shallow, so they couldn't have been plowed, fortunately. Rocks were removed to facilitate mowing for hay, and some of those rocks can be seen around the edges of the plateau. Interestingly, it was noted that Lantana Camaro was present in abundance on the slopes of the plateau in 1948, 1950. And the previous owner of that farm used it for haymaking. And then he would cut hay and then graze heavily in autumn and winter afterwards, and then burn whatever was left at the end of winter. And we've got some photos in 1937. There's evidence of what might have been water holes and evidence of some use there. 1944, and then in 1959, after 9 years, you can clearly see the burning and mowing experiment, and the veld fertilizer experiment is on that side. And just a couple of images later on, 1967, 2009, and then the most recent one in 2025 shows the fertilizer experiment quite nicely because all the corridors had just been mown before the image was taken. So what are the experiments? The burning and mowing experiment, which we are now transitioning to call the Ukulinga Grassland Fire Experiment, to give it a bit more context for international people and people who don't know what the burning and mowing trial is. It's a fully replicated experiment with 4 main summer utilization treatments. Either nothing, in other words, no defoliation in summer, or defoliating in about December when the grass is about 20 centimeters high, or 1 defoliation at the end of February, or 2 defoliations, 1 in December and 1 in February. And then within those main blocks, there's either no removal treatment, no burning, or annual burning in winter, spring, biannual winter, spring and autumn, triannual winter, spring and autumn, and then annual mowing in the first week of August and annual mowing after rains, which coincide time-wise to those annual burning treatments. So there's a whole range of different treatments that provide very valuable information on how grass responds to both fire and to defoliation. It's not grazing, but it's a non-selective form of defoliation. So key results of the burning experiment are that when fire and mowing are excluded, then you get alien trees and shrubs invading, and more recently, quite a nice indigenous understory of trees and shrubs, but still dominated by aliens in the upper story. And the dominant grass is Aristida junciformis. So Aristida doesn't mind not being defoliated. It doesn't become moribund and die. It actually thrives under no defoliation. Where plots are mown in summer, they don't respond that strongly to fire treatment. The non-selective defoliation treatment of the mowing has the overriding impact on the species composition and cover. But where there's no summer defoliation, fire has a very strong impact. And with annual burns, the sward is quite short, dominated by Thermida triandra and other short grasses. It's diverse, highest diversities in the annual burns, and has relatively high basal cover. And the top photo shows an annual winter burn on a particular plot. And the bottom photo shows a triennial burn. And where we see a reduction in fire frequency, the sward becomes taller, dominated by Symbipogans, Aristidas, Eragrostis curvula, other taller grasses, much lower basal cover, lower grass diversity, lower forb diversity is less affected, but grass diversity is very much affected. And we're starting to get indigenous and alien tree and shrub encroachment. So there's a dead wattle tree, there's some lantana, and there's a couple of acacias in the triennial plot, Acacia nilotica. Not Facelia nilotica, we haven't kept up with the names. And then what's interesting is the unburnt plots. And here's a photo from 1998 of one of the unburnt plots. Note the vehicle in the background. That's a jacaranda tree, a couple of syringas, and a few indigenous acacias, and Aristida and Symbipogan mainly. And then in 2025, from the same spot, you can still see the jacaranda tree. There is a vehicle parked in exactly the same spot, but you can't see that. And the encroachment with lack of fire and lack of mowing, that's what a grassland turns to without disturbance. So the results from the burning experiment give us a lot of opportunity to develop a really good understanding of how grassland ecosystems function. And the fact that the experiment is such a long term, it makes it a very valuable resource. If we switch to the fertilizer experiment, the treatments, again, fully replicated. The treatments were nitrogen at 3 levels in the form of limestone ammonium nitrate, which is not very acidifying. Nitrogen at 3 levels in the form of ammonium sulfate, which is acidifying, phosphorus, lime, and then obviously a control. And again, laid out in a fully replicated experiment. Key results: fertilizer alters the sward structure, productivity, species composition, and importantly, reduces diversity quite dramatically. So you have taller grasses. Phosphorus alone has not much impact. High nitrogen increases productivity and sward height, leading to dominance by Eragrostis curvula. And when you have nitrogen and phosphorus together, they interact quite strongly. You have a further increase in productivity and height, and panicum maximum becomes dominant. So you can actually walk through those plots without a plot plan and see what the treatments are just by looking at the species. And lime does influence species composition a bit through pH mediation. Okay, let's look at some of the outputs of the experiment. And this is quite interesting that in the first number of decades, there were actually very few publications. In the 2000s, they actually jumped quite nicely, and that's number of publications on the x-axis. So that's climbed nicely and is on an upward trend. But after, when the first final report was written in the mid-1970s, there'd only been 2 publications. Citations: there are a number of publications that have been very highly cited from both experiments, and that's quite nice to see, and those are continuing to climb. If we look at the general topics covered, we've grouped them into effects on soil and ecosystem properties, effects on plant diversity, invert and microbial responses, comparative studies, remote sensing, and biomass. And each of those experiments has had a number of papers in each of those categories. The burning experiment, 26 papers, nutrient experiment, 24, local journals, relatively low numbers, and international journals much higher. The nationality of authors of those papers, burning experiment has had 93 authors and co-authors from 10 countries, with South Africa being about half, South African authors being about half of those, where the fertilizer experiment or nutrient experiment has had less authors and more dominated by South Africans at this stage. So more opportunity for collaboration. For the authors, we've looked at the number of authors, how prolific they are, and we've got a list of people, mainly South Africans, but some Americans and other nationalities coming in, which again shows opportunity for collaboration. Okay, so what's going to happen in the next 75 years? Well, on the nutrient experiment, we've actually started in 2019 a reversal, where the plots are big enough to actually split in two, and you can see each plot where it would have, the whole plot would have been given a treatment. We've now split them in half, and that half gets nothing, and the other half carries on as normal. And after now 5 years of that, we can actually see huge differences in productivity, nothing yet really in species composition, but the productivity differences are so marked that you can actually pick it up on Google Earth, and you can see the differences in the plots. We need to do more work on fire atmosphere, things like carbon sequestration, fire behavior. Soil biology is something that needs a lot of work, and this is a great opportunity to look at both experiments, at either the effect of nutrients or the effect of fire on defoliation on soil biology. So there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of work to emphasize issues that have not been covered yet. So what we want to do with those experiments is really focus on international and local collaboration going forward. We want to get some really high profile outputs in really prominent journals to publicize the experiments further, use them for postgrad training, use them to develop new research questions, new directions, new ideas, try to ensure that there's continued funding for those experiments, because currently since 1975, they've actually been unfunded and just been running on a kind of ad hoc basis. And it would be nice to have some continued funding for that. And then lastly, we've got a number of associated international long-term experiments that have started at Ukulinga, NutNet, DroughtNet, and DragNet, which cover nutrients, drought and nutrients, and disturbance and recovery that are international and replicated multiple times across the world in the same way. And thank you very much for your attention. A lot of people have put a lot of time and effort into those experiments. And there is a paper highlighted at the bottom that is in press at the moment, will be in the next issue of the journal, which covers most of what I've said today. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Kevin. Have we got a question before we move on to our next speaker? Yes, Andrew. Have we got a roving mic somewhere near there?
How much has the trial been used for extension type work for farmers to come and see what the results are?
Sorry, can you repeat that into the mic just for the online audience? Sorry, Andrew.
Sorry. How much has been done on extension work so that farmers can come and learn from what's happened at the trials?
Not enough. We do have groups of people that come through. We've had school groups, we've had other university groups, and we have had farmers groups, but most definitely not enough. So this is an open invitation for people like yourself to bring groups there. We'll happily host them and happily have discussions around the results of the experiments and how they can be applied.
Right, thank you very much, Kevin. Let's keep moving on to our next speaker. So a slight change to the program. Clinton Carbutt is unfortunately not able to attend today, but Tim O'Connor, who is one of his co-authors, has kindly agreed to present. Tim's from the University of Witwatersrand, and he's going to be speaking to us about mesoscale variation in the plant soil neighborhood in montane grasslands. Thank you, Tim.
Good morning, everyone. Yes. So Clinton unfortunately ended up in hospital. I never start a public address with an apology, so this is a factual statement. My name might be there, but I'm a bit of a peripheral attachment to this effort. And I have to admit, I saw this material for the first time on Saturday when Clinton visited, but we'll see what we can do with it. Mesoscale variation, let's just put that in context. And why bother to look at it? And let's first look at the actual environment in which we're in. This is the berg, the point of the Nutnet site here. Kevin's just referred to Nutnet. This is about a kilometer beyond the Brotherton burning trials, up at about between 1800, 1900. Classic Drakensberg Plateau grassland. And he was setting up a Nutnet site. So this is Clinton's personal endeavor. As a consequence, he's a biogeographer, worked primarily in the Berg, or a lot of his efforts have been in the Berg other than conservation across the province. And he became very interested in the role nitrogen plays in looking at the floral patterns in the Berg. And therefore, he joined Nutnet. Now, he's not a classical ecologist by training, so for him, this is quite an exciting venture to launch into ecology. So we are pre-experiment here. So block out any idea of what Nutnet is, nutrient addition. We're not at that stage. We're at the stage where you get baseline data, but you have to see it in the context. When you do an experiment, you look for a relatively uniform, homogeneous patch as best you can find in a montane environment. He did that. Where's your little time thing got to? Plants react to the immediate environment around them. And the bigger picture when we go measure compositional variation is nothing more than the aggregated response of countless numbers of individual plants reacting to what occurs in their immediate environment. And usually with phytosociology, we're looking at vegetation environment relations at quite a broad brush scale. There are very few studies which hone in and look at a finer scale, which to me is pointing the way towards really identifying at that little patch level, which are the environmental variables directly responsible for change in that grassland. So Clinton's experiment over time is looking at these sorts of things, but for the baseline, we've obviously got measures of community composition, measures of biomass. We're looking at soil physicochemical properties. And one I'd like to pick out, very simple, rarely measured soil depth. He adopted the protocols of the Nutnet approach, and he's got a standard factorial design for their additions of NP and K. Here's just a quick picture of the layout. So he's got 30 plots, and I can't add it up. It's something like 25 yards, 37 by 29 meters or whatever. So you're on a small little patch of land. Each little plot there is 2.5 by 2.5, split into 4, and you do measurements in each of those 4 quadrants for different things. And only one of the little quadrants is reserved for actually plant species and composition. That stays fixed. You clip above ground biomass in another, and you take the soil samples in another. So there's not an exact spatial correspondence per plot for obvious reasons, because you otherwise impact on what you're doing. Now, the first point, and getting back to the theme I sort of tried to promote in a talk the other day, we have what I would consider relatively low richness on this grassland, varied from, and this is per meter squared, from 12 to a maximum of 18 species per meter squared, which if you've worked in some of our mesic grasslands is actually a relatively low number. Now, the point is the Brotherton Spur in its history at one stage, and this lasted for at least half a century, it's estimated, had thousands of sheep pumped up there during summer to graze. The other thing is it was occasionally used for, it's a relatively level plateau used for haymaking. So these are major disturbances, and in particular, the haymaking can have an incredible effect on forb diversity, which actually also emerged at Ukulinga. And we have a relatively low sort of variance in species composition. At the time of the trial, so remember, put aside what nutrient addition has done. We had a completely perennial grassland. We encountered no annuals and importantly, no alien invasives. And as with almost all grasslands, even though the forb richness might have been a bit depauperate, it still accounted for 73% of species richness, whereas, well, as the name implies, grasslands accounted for the biomass. And it's a classic, what used to in old days be termed a sort of highland South grassland going a little bit higher. Thermida Tristachia, Heteropogon, Harpocloa, with Caleria capensis, a C3 coming in, otherwise a C4 grassland. It's a grassland that's regularly burnt there. If we actually get quite a lot of bare ground. And the other thing about the Berg, a little pet subject I always would like to have seen addressed, and I'm not aware that anyone's looked really deeply at the ecological role of Cryptomus hodentotus. You get a lot of mounds, they turning over the soil, they there. Obvious differences already referred to in above ground plant biomass between the two simple functional types of grasses versus forbs, and obviously they change seasonally as well. Now, here's a very simple statement, but I think one that actually needs closer focus. Grass biomass was positively associated with soil depth. This is something we hardly ever measure because it's difficult. Yet, I believe in all the systems I've worked, it's probably one of the most important variables. For biomass was negatively correlated with soil N. You might argue an obvious expected outcome if you sort of follow Tillman's resource ratio hypothesis ideas. And a couple of others, relationships there on which we need not dwell too much, because I want to quickly get on to some key patterns. Yeah, this is the variation in above ground plant biomass and the nutrient content of the plants. And if we go through this, first let's find biomass bottom right there. I mean, it expresses the obvious, and there is a key seasonal change for both forbs and grasses as you go from spring to summer to autumn. Hardly surprising that, there's a seasonal cycle. Why there is such a reduction in autumn, which is obviously growth has ceased, but there's actually an indication that attrition has already taken place, because you should, if there's no attrition, you would have the standing biomass in place. But I want to just look at the actual just go through CA, K, MG, N, P, CU as well, NA as well, and ZN, if you look carefully. There's a simple story there. If you take into account season, the tissue content, the actual concentration, which is what's getting reflected here, of all those is higher in forbs at any given time in the season, and often right across the season they will be higher. I mean, look at CA, irrespective of the pattern within forbs in the season, it's always higher than within grasses, which is just a simple indication of the kind of growth strategies. And here's I don't like this because this is a PCA. I like PCAs, but in terms of trying to look at the pattern of the tissue concentrations, they've included biomass here, which I don't sort of agree with, because there's a confound in there. So obviously the first axis is defined by biomass, but if you start looking, you can actually see, and obviously that discriminates grasses on the left from forbs on the right, and certain patterning which we can't get into here, and that patterning does change on a seasonal basis. So irrespective of the finesse, the judgments made in how to approach this, it is nonetheless, for purposes here, an adequate illustration. First, that spring and summer are much the same, but a significant seasonal change. So in the remaining time, just to emphasize what are some simple points, yet recognize the context of what we call in mesoscale. So we're not right down at an individual plant. We're not at the phytosociological level. It's a kind of little plot. And what story it might tell us is that even in a plot that was selected for homogeneity and in which there is not a really marked variation in species composition, we find that there is significant association of variation with soil properties. And obviously, bare ground's not expected. This big open question of what the whole role of burrowing activities of Cryptomus, the mole rats, is all about. And to re-emphasize soil depth with its association with biomass, which obviously in a functional sense is you've got a deeper profile, can store more soil. The berg, it might be wet, but it also gets incredibly hot on occasion. You know, water can be limiting there, and that's a consequence, well, a situation that the biota there have to accommodate. Clinton's proposing that deeper soils facilitate extensive fibrous root development necessary for montane grasses to access soil moisture and nutrients in a nutrient-limited environment. Okay, we have not shown the extensive fibrous root development, but it's a fair assumption. Certainly a nutrient-limited environment has been shown, whether you see it in these results or not. And that soil depth is therefore having an influence on these factors. I've mentioned the legacies of livestock grazing and mowing, and obviously fire is a big deal. I mean, grasslands are defined by fire. We're not going into this, other than to say whatever's happened there was uniform, we would assume, across that tiny little patch. I doubt that there was a succession of fires that ended halfway through the patch, through its history. So notwithstanding that fires have shaped this area, for the purposes of this investigation, we can put it aside. So yes, above ground plant biomass is slowing. Forb biomass comes out as very closely correlated with nutrients. Strong soil plant coupling in terms of plant nutrients. NNP peaking right at the start of the season, and perhaps I should have pointed that out. As a consequence of mineralization, that's, you know, basic seasonal thing has been around since the 1940s, and Clinton's also shown that for these environments. But the point is, grasses and forbs are handling the situation very differently. He's putting out that they're showing this trade-off, whereas forbs, by contrast, are more heavily invested in nutrients than biomass. He gets into storage organs. I'm not completely sold on that, and I'd really have to get back into the literature to look at the role of crowns in grasses. But I think the point is, the role of this little experiment, this background data, is giving insights that might otherwise have been overlooked. And these sorts of things could be, I think, quite insightful if explored in a couple of other experimental contexts. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tim. Can we have one question before we move on to our next speaker? There's a question over there. You can wait for the mic, please.
I thought that was great data with the forbs, higher nutrient contents than the grasses. I don't know if it was per gram, but anyway, do you think this is something that's really been overlooked in herbivore nutrition, whether wild or domestic? Has anyone looked at that?
Well, okay, a couple of things have been overlooked. Forbs have been overlooked in all roles in grassland ecology until reasonably recently, and they're only starting to emerge now. In grazing systems in which sheep or goats are a major component, and this strikes me in particular about work in the Highland Southveld, they've concentrated on grasses, not recognizing that forbs can be up to 30% of intake of sheep. So, and obviously sheep are going to be showing selection patterns both based on nutrient content and obviously other chemicals as well. So yes, it has been extremely overlooked. We're looking at these concentrations in essentially even invertebrate consumption is pretty light. I mean, you know, vertebrate consumption up there is minimal by and large, unless a herd of eland happened to sit in a spot. And invertebrate consumption, there's quite a biomass of grasshoppers around at certain times, but grasshoppers are grasshoppers. So, you know what, how much consumption is taking place of forbs is also, and this is what I'm trying to say, there is basic ecology out there, which is not explored. And I think forbs are an incredibly good example of that overall. That's not to dismiss that a lot of people are looking at forbs at this point in time. but let's say it's in its infancy.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay, great, thanks.
Our next speaker this morning is Mike Peel from the Agricultural Research Council, and he's going to be telling us about elephant impacts on vegetation structure in the Greater Kruger area. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, assessing the impacts of changing elephant densities on woody vegetation structure and biomass using field data and remote sense data. And here I have to acknowledge my many co-authors who are remote sensing experts, unlike me, especially Conrad Wessels. Okay, so our problem statement is that there is a lack of empirical evidence directly linking elephant density changes to specific magnitudes of vegetation structural changes across extensive conservation areas. And the sequence of fence removal between the private reserves and the Kruger Park has essentially created a macro experiment as elephant access and free movement has been reestablished, and also along a known timeline. And not all the fences have been removed, so that increases the value of this project. So the overall goal of the research is to quantify the impacts of changes in elephant densities on remotely sensed woody vegetation cover, biomass, and in situ canopy cover in private reserves with different elephant access and density histories. And the objectives is to quantify annual changes in woody vegetation cover and above ground biomass density predicted from SAR data using models developed from field and airborne LiDAR reference data, and to determine the relationship between the changes in elephant densities and in-field and remotely sensed estimates of woody cover and biomass. Okay, so just to provide a little bit of context, and I always do this, up till about 1900, we had the Drakensberg Mountains there and what is now Mozambique on this side, and very little in between. So the animals had the freedom of movement from Mozambique all the way to the Drakensberg. This all changed. When these areas to the west of Kruger and in Kruger were actually surveyed in the early 1900s. To the right, where the dark line is, Kruger, obviously that wasn't exercised, but on the left, many fences went up and into private land ownership, and this has had a massive impact on the way these systems function. It's gone again a little bit more into consolidation of land with fences coming down, and the fences between Kruger coming down with the Sabi Sands and the APNR, about 212,000 hectares there. And more recently, and Tim spoke to that on Monday, is this extension of these conservation areas into Zimbabwe and Mozambique. The focus study area is this area to the sort of west of the central Kruger National Park. It's around about 400,000 hectares that we look at, maybe a little bit less. And I think one of the things I just want to say here is that the water distribution, I believe, has really impacted the way these systems function. You're sitting here in the APNR with a water density of 1 water point per 700 hectares, whereas in the Kruger Park, in a buffer, 10-kilometer buffer along the western boundary, there's 1 water point per 50,000 hectares. So there's a massive difference. And some of the arguments that the elephants will move from south to north and the weaners will die and the population will level off is sort of a little bit debatable when you can walk across the fence to a completely excessively watered area. And that really has had an impact on the way these systems function. So some things that influence savanna trees: environmental, rainfall template, carbon dioxide levels, and then you have management drivers on top of that, fire frequency, herbivory, and humans, and they all interact to influence the tree recruitment and growth and survival. And there is a balance that has to be struck with the grass layer, which is also a strong competitor. We realize that tree recruitment is episodic into taller height classes and structure is important. And then we have elephant in our system, which is also a bit of a game changer. So this I know little about. I wrote it from what Conrad said. In that we looked at field to LiDAR biomass modeling to monitor the impact of high elephant densities on woody cover and biomass, LiDAR to above ground biomass density modeling, and the woody density and canopy cover data, which has been ground truth. So it's a real link between the remote sense data and our on-ground data. And we have over 400 sites in these areas. And then the elephant densities are derived from aerial surveys, annual aerial surveys, and georeference. So they're spatially very tight, but for only one time of the year. Okay, and then we also examined 19 tree data for 19 sites from the early 2000s in an area where the fence with Kruger National Park has been removed. And we compared that to an area, an adjacent area where elephants have been excluded by a high wire. It's only 139 hectares, but we put in 34 paired plots there. So that was quite an interesting experiment. Effectively the same environmental and biotic drivers in these areas. We looked at tree density trends for trees greater than 5 meters in this instance. We can go all the way through 4 classes. Tree canopy cover trends, and the elephant spectrum, as I said, for both experiments, we're from many elephants to no elephant. Okay, so this is a bit of a messy graph, but the things I really want to show that in a lot of these areas, elephants per square kilometer, you're sitting at a density of well over 1 elephant per square kilometer. And in certain instances where the fence was removed, it went up to between 5 and 5.5 elephants per square kilometer. The fence with the Greater Kruger was removed. So there was a big influx here, and it sort of reverted down to still over 2 elephants per square kilometer. And an adjacent property where there were very few elephants and the fence fell into disrepair, there was this massive increase of elephants. So we're sitting at 4, and because they put the fence up again, it's a 4,000 hectare property. This elephant density is just creeping up, and with quite heavy consequences. Okay, so this is the remote sense data. And I think we're just going to focus on this side here where you've got this SAR cover change with above ground density and canopy. And if you look at these very red areas, or this area, for example, the Khululiwe Reserve has had elephants in there for an extended period of time, whereas some of these smaller areas haven't had elephants in, and they've just, in 2017, that fence came down, and that's the change in canopy cover and tree density just as a result of the elephants. Now, that little white area there, if you can see it, is that exclosure that I spoke about. So you can see what an impact the elephants have had in this area, in Thorny Bush, and in Sandringham, those 2 areas that I've showed you the steep increases in elephant density. And then an area on the Olifants River that also had a fence removed, and one small property there that removed its fence in the last few years. And then a place like Raptors View, which has had no elephants for over 100 years. So I think it's a really nice experiment to look at all these different scenarios that have unfolded. And there's just a graphic of that cover change, where these areas are the canopy cover in the recently dropped fences, and you can see the elephants have had a massive impact on the cover in these areas. And these 3 are larger, older reserves which have had elephants for a longer period of time, which are also showing slight declines in elephant density. And what are the implications of that? So this is a bit of a messy graphic, but I think it's important. We're going to go from, it's a time series data per reserve of elephant density there, field canopy cover there, the SAR cover there, and the above ground biomass density. So you've got 4 axes here, which seems a bit complicated, but it's not that bad. So you can see we don't have elephant data. There aren't elephant on Andover, and we don't have sites there, so we can't really put our field canopy information there, but it's from the SAR derived data, it's fairly constant. When we look at an area without elephant, also fairly constant, no big declines. Some of these actual field data measurements here show fluctuations, which is what happens in the canopy layer. But, and probably due to the drought at that time, we might have had a bit of a reduction in canopy, but now we're sitting back at higher canopy levels. I'm not going to go through all of these. The green bars are the elephant density. So in a place like Kapama, you're getting slight increases in elephant density, slight declines in the actual data measured, and the SAR data also showing those. The Sabi sand complex, I don't know if you can see it, but also fairly high elephant densities, and you're having these canopy declines which are reflected in the SAR data as well. But the real winner here are those two reserves where there have been these influxes of elephants from very few low densities here in Thornybush and Sandringham to extremely high densities over a very short period. And as you can see, as those elephant densities, the green bars went up, the actual canopy measured in the field and the SAR data density and biomass declined markedly. And here you can see the same trend. So what we're picking up on the ground, we're picking up with the remote sensing. And I think the strength of that is the spatial implications of that the actual point data, the site data that we have is speaking to the remote sense data. And is that how much time I've got left? Yes. Okay. So, all right. So there are extensive loss rates, as you can see there. Here we also have in the second experiment, you can see the loss in tall trees in those sites over 19 years. We've lost all the trees greater than 5 meters, and it's not rainfall linked because you've got ups and downs in the rainfall. But watch, as soon as those elephant started increasing, they started declining, and you have the same pattern in the tree canopy on those same sites. Okay, with elephants increasing and the canopy. So that speaks to the remote sensed and ground truth data that I spoke to earlier. There are the pictures. It looks like that's the exclosure, and that's outside and inside. So what we have done is, I think, fairly novel. We've linked the ground truth and remote sense data to reflect the same story, and it allows us to apply the results at a large spatial scale. Where to from here? It's not all bad news. The opening up of the understory is quite good for the grass component to come away, and for tourism visibility, that works well. But for big trees, it's not looking good, and homogenization is not something we would like to see. And then, so what are the sort of temporal and spatial consequences of elephant on the system? Has the sweet spot been exceeded? So they've opened up the understory, but where are we going now in terms of trees as nutrient pumps? And what is the effect of that on grass composition in the long term with your shade-loving, nutritious, palatable grasses? Things like nesting birds, predator interactions, leopards and lions. The leopards are moving quite a lot into these thicker areas. And what is the effect on other herbivores? I mean, up to 70% of the biomass is made up of elephant at this stage. Yeah, so the impact is real. Those are the management options. Do nothing, translocate. Nobody wants elephants. Contraception, it's a big job, too big. Range manipulation, close water, which is not really an option when you've got land ownership over all these properties. Feeding, not an option. And then there's obviously the unpalatable culling option. But those are the things that we're dealing with. And the tendency to deal with elephant in isolation is obviously problematic. I'm not going there, but I just want to thank all these people who have spent years and years collecting these data for us. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Mike. Right, so we got one question. Rich has got a question.
Thanks, Mike. Very good data, interesting. And I mean, in northern Botswana, where the elephant populations are much higher, they're smashing the place. They are absolutely smashing it. And the biggest problem is they're spreading south. The elephants are spreading south in Botswana, and I see this madness going on. We have to start to do something, because we cannot allow this elephant population to absolutely dominate everything like this. I see there's major problems coming. Kruger has to do something, otherwise you're going to end up in a northern Botswana situation where it's out of hand, really. Yeah. So, yeah. But yeah, culling is the only way. I really see it. Yeah.
Thanks for that comment, Richard. Yeah, we've actually just put in an elephant management plan for the APNR, and we've pushed strongly for active management now. We can't keep kicking the can down the road. Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much, Mike. So there were a couple of other questions. So yeah, if you can catch Mike at tea time, maybe while you're in the coffee queue. Our next speaker, continuing with the theme of the Agricultural Research Council, is Khululiwe Ntombela, and she's going to be talking to us about grazing management in the various South African biomes. Thank you.
Thank you. As introduced, so I'll just jump in straight into my talk, which is based on a part of a bigger project that we did as ARC, funded by the Department of Agriculture, where we did research with livestock farmers around 5 biomes in South Africa during the 2025-2022 drought that we experienced. Now, in South Africa, we normally generalize grazing management to be between either rotational grazing or to be continuous grazing. However, we believe that our rangelands and our land tenure systems in South Africa are far more diverse and far more complex for us to use these 2 dualistic descriptions. So therefore, we need to identify and provide detailed descriptions of the grazing management systems that farmers are implementing in their respective biomes and in the respective land tenure systems that we have in South Africa, so that for lack of a better word, so that our policies and our livestock programs in South Africa could be much more effective. And also then we can try and change the narrative that Professor Einskoens was talking about in his presentation, where he said that there's a narrative to say that especially pastoralists or smallholder farmers are generally unproductive or unviable. So therefore we need these detailed descriptions of the grazing management systems that we find in our country, which is basically then was the aim or were the aims of this part of the bigger project, to see or identify the grazing management systems used, and also then to see what are the factors that actually influence the implementation of these grazing management systems that the farmers are implementing. And how we did this is that we interviewed, or we selected 94 livestock farmers around South Africa in the relative biomes, being 31 farmers in the savanna, 22 in the grasslands, 26 in the Namakuru, 11 in the Suckland Karoo, and 4 in the Albany thicket. And the proportion of the farmers that were chosen was in relation to the proportion of the land or the area that the biome occupies. So the bigger the biome space, then the more farmers that we needed to select for that particular farmer to get enough responses from the farmers. And the selection of these farmers was, included government officials, current or retired researchers, and also then other farmers identifying who they regarded as champion farmers in their relative areas. So you might be asking, what is a champion farmer? So there is an article that was published this year by Letswalo, where he described the attributes of what makes a champion farmer. And in summary, he defined it as a passionate farmer who has adaptive management skills and knowledge that they have gotten through trial and error, and they are seen as resilient to shocks. So when the farmers were then identified by the relative people or by the relative key informants, then we contacted the farmers and asked for their willingness to participate in the study. And once they have agreed, then there was a written consent that was provided for us to do semi-constructed interviews with the farmer. And the focus of the semi-structured interviews were based on questions that were around the type of grazing management system that the farmer is using, the reasons behind why they're using that grazing management system, and also the actual actions that they are implementing on their farm that go hand in hand with the grazing system that they are actually using on their farm. And also, after we did that, then we took all the responses that we got from the farmers, and then we classified them according to descriptions that Lorraine van der Berg actually described in an unpublished 22 report. And I think this is where I get nervous now, because I see her sitting in the audience. So I need to make a good impression of it. So then after the classification that we did from the 94 responses, we actually found that there was only 69 responses that we could actually use for our comparative content analysis for our results section because they provided detailed explanations that we could actually get information from and analyze. And then in terms of what we found now, in summary, we found that there are 11 grazing management systems that farmers are implementing in South Africa throughout the 5 biomes that were under study. And I'm not going to go into detail in explaining all of them because honestly, I don't think I remember all the definitions of all of those 11. But out of all those 11, 6 were being implemented in the savanna, 5 in the grassland, 11 in the Nama Karoo, and then 6 in the succulent Karoo, and then the L-band thicket only having 4. And then you might be asking yourself now, why is the Nama Karoo so famous with the different grazing management systems that were being implemented? So now we think that, we think that now if you look at the locality of where the Nama Karoo is actually situated in South Africa, it is surrounded by all the other different biomes. So then in the bigger part of the project, we actually found that farmers were actually reporting that farmer-to-farmer engagements were an important access to information or access to knowledge to them. And since the study was done during a drought, then it actually points out the importance of farmer networks or social networks that exist between the farmers. And it actually points out the trial and error of the description of the champion farmer, to say that farmers were trying out different grazing systems that the neighboring farmers were doing in their biomes to see that if it will work out on their farms, then they would continue doing it. If not, then they will not, just to try and survive the drought. But the 3 major implemented grazing management systems that we found that was common in most of the biomes, the first ranking them from the first to the third. The first one being daily herding, which was being implemented in all the biomes except for the L-band thicket. The second one being the 3-camp rotation system that was being implemented in the Nama Karoo, the savanna, and the succulent Karoo. In the Nama Karoo, farmers mentioned to use 3 grazing between January and March, 6 months resting between April to September, and then 3 months grazing again between October to December. And for the savanna Karoo, they mentioned to actually be implementing a 3 months grazing with 4 months resting in their camps. And for the succulent Karoo, they mentioned to be doing rotations every 3 months, where their major rotations were mostly being done in January and in August. And the third one being the group camp approach, which is basically classified as the farmers identifying or using landscape in their farm to actually classify or identify key resource areas in their rangelands, and therefore setting up plots in those key resource areas in their rangelands according to the livestock requirements that they have for their particular livestock. And what was noticeable with this is that throughout all the 4 biomes that implemented it, the farmers mentioned mountains to be a very important key resource area where they would graze the mountains, especially during the dry seasons, so that they can access more good quality forage during the dry season when the lowlands actually have lower forage quality plants. And then when we came to the different land tenure systems, we saw that the private farms and the trust farms were implementing much more of the more structured and more intensive grazing management systems, while the land reform and the communal farmers were implementing much more of the grazing system that relied more on traditional methods for them to be effective in their relative places. And then what we could see was that throughout everything, livestock movement was a key factor, whether it was daily or monthly or weekly or seasonal, farmers were moving. And this movement, farmers mentioned them to aid them to reduce selective grazing, also to aid in resting the veld, and also then to protect their livestock from predation or then from stock theft. Now, but you might be asking, but isn't that all that rotational grazing? Of which, yes, I do agree with you. It is rotational grazing, but the point we're trying to raise with this is that we should not generalize to say that it's just rotational grazing, because it differs per biome, per lantana, depending on the region that the farmer is located in. So therefore, we need these detailed explanations of what actually are the farmers doing, so that we can try and improve our livestock production in system and try and change the narratives that are already there to say they are being mostly unproductive. When we did further analysis with the data that we had to see, are there any similarities between these grazing management systems? We found that yes, there are indeed similarities between them, ranging from 44% to some of them having 88% similarities between the grazing management systems. And we saw two distinct clusters or clades that were visible, one being a mixed tenure production system, which relies on these grazing management systems, which, as said, are much more traditional methods of grazing, and then a private production-orientated production system, which uses much more of the intense and structured. And these ones were mostly used by, okay, so the mixed tenure was mostly used by land reform farmers and communal farmers who had shared access to natural resources, and also then had a diverse vegetation around them that they could partition according to natural available forage, quality, quantity, and through inspections of visual assessments by the farmers. And also they relied mostly on herders to be present for the grazing management system to be effective. So therefore raising the importance of local knowledge or indigenous knowledge for those traditional systems. And with the private production ones, they were mostly implemented on private and trust farms, which were large areas where there was either one owner or one family. And so therefore their management or the decisions on their management were much more singular as compared to the mixed tenure ones where it was multiple users or multiple beneficiaries using a shared natural resource. And with the private production, they mostly relied on the availability of fences so that they could subdivide their farms into relative grazing units or grazing camps, therefore raising the importance of fencing infrastructure to be present and to be available. And in those camps, farmers mentioned that plants that they would find in those camps, they would desire, or they have the desire for them to be in, to have a similar grazing value of being more nutritious plants, and that technical knowledge was a requirement for these grazing systems that fell under this type of private production orientated, where then that knowledge was helping them to access or calculate grazing capacities. So in closing, this study, we found that at the end of the story, South Africa has diverse grazing management systems, of which some of them have overlapping and comparative characteristics. So therefore, we need to move away from a one-fits-all approach to a much more context-specific approaches, where we try and move away from introducing the high production-driven models into under-resourced areas, so that our production system can thrive in South Africa, especially for the small communal farmers. And because we saw that land tenure infrastructural support or institutional policies and knowledge was a main factor that was driving or was influencing the type of grazing management system used by the farmers. I would like to thank you all, and thank also my team, and thank Tutuko and Julius, which I believe are in the audience, since they are not in the picture, but they were involved with the bigger project. Thank you.
Thank you, Khululiwe. One question for Khululiwe before she goes.
As I was about to run away.
No, you're not going anywhere just yet. They might be. Oh, no.
Tutuko.
I thought they were giving you a stay of execution.
I want to confirm something, Khululiwe. You're saying farmers prefer to take their animals away from their homestead to the mountains in winter so that they can access those nutritious forages and stuff. I would have expected the opposite, that they take them away in summer, and then maybe in winter they bring them closer so that it's easier to supplement in case they need to, because in winter that is where they might need to work with animals more. I don't know if I heard you correctly.
Okay. What you heard is that yes, in some areas, then the dry season will be in the winter months, and then in some areas it will be in the summer months. But that's actually one thing that we struggled with, to actually understand that why are actually farmers doing this? And luckily, I'm very fortunate that I attended this conference, because I was happy to actually hear Richard's talk when he actually mentioned that some farmers are actually doing facilitated grazing, where they would graze a particular area for a short time and then come back to it before it's fully grown and the plants are fully at high levels of growth. So that I think from here, we need to really sit down with it and try to actually see from the interviews, because everything that I've just presented was based on the interviews, to actually see that were actually farmers doing that type of facilitation, or were they just sacrificing some camps or some areas in their farms or in their landscapes just to try and survive the drought that they were experiencing at that time.
Thank you, Khululiwe.
Thank you.
Right, just a quick reminder before we move on to our next presentation, please do not forget to adjudicate presentations. So at the top of the second page with talks from this session, there's a QR code there. Please scan it. It will take you to the form to adjudicate talks from this session. It's very important for us to get your feedback so that we can select the best presentations, and obviously also please adjudicate the posters for our awards for the gala dinner tonight. So our next presenter, moving on to SAON, is Tony Swemmer, and he is going to be telling us the other side of the story with elephants and their importance as key species for helping control woody encroachment. Thank you.
Thanks. So before I start, let me just acknowledge a whole bunch of other SAON staff and volunteers over the years who have helped in collecting this data, quite a long list. Right, so quite strange to have so many elephant talks at a grassland congress. My talk's not really about elephants, it's more about this topic, bush encroachments. Doesn't need any introduction. It's been spoken about 1,000 times at these congresses. And there's a whole range of drivers of bush encroachment with various amounts of evidence for them, but none really definitive on its own. A lack of browsers has been suggested as at least partial cause of bush encroachment in the past. And of course, elephants are browsers. So a lot of work on elephants is about how they are killing tall trees. Mark Peel just gave a great talk showing how that is happening over large scales. But elephants don't only feed on tall trees. In fact, most of the time they are feeding on small trees or shrubs. And you just don't, it's not as visually impactful, but obviously it's happening. And sometimes they really get quite enthusiastic about it and they can actually rip a whole shrub out the ground and kill it. So could elephants actually play a significant role in reducing the density of small trees and shrubs and mitigating or undoing bush encroachment? Or from another perspective, could the absence of elephants in the past through excessive hunting have led to some of the bush encroachment we saw in the past century? So that's not a new idea, certainly not my idea. It's kind of difficult to believe that over such big scales, elephants could be impacting so many individual plants. But it is possible. And what got me interested actually in that specific question are these results. We collaborated with scientific services in Kruger National Park, sandparks, to resample some of the experimental burn plots. So this is a very long-term large-scale burning experiment set up in Kruger. I won't go into the details, but what we found by looking at a series of historical vegetation surveys is that tree density, and that's tree and shrub, has been declining at least two of the sites, regardless of burning treatment. We don't see this at the wettest part of the park, and at another site we see more or less stable tree densities. So what could cause that? It's obviously not fire because it's happening regardless of fire. So elephants are a plausible explanation for that. Of course, there are other possible explanations. Maybe it's drought or changes in mesoherbivores or grass layer competition, whatever. So ideally, you would want a more manipulative approach to understand the impact of elephants, where you can compare two systems that are similar in all other respects except for elephants. So that hasn't really been done because that's very difficult work to do. Just incidentally, those two sites where there was a decline in woody species densities, in woody density, also had higher rates of elephant impacts on the trees. So anyway, at SAON, about 15 years ago, we started setting up tree demography plots to look at tree dynamics in more detail. This involved tagging individual trees and keeping track of them every year. This was actually done more in the context of climate change. The main motivation was to try and capture the impacts of future droughts. But the data does allow for testing elephant impacts as well. So we set these plots up at a range of sites through the central lowveld. The idea was to capture a variety of soil types and land use and land management types. Some of them inside Kruger National Park, most of them outside. And they weren't designed to test elephant impact specifically, but some of them can be used for that. So up at the top, we had sites at the Letaba exclosure, and this included a partial exclosure, which excluded elephants, but nothing else. So that's quite a nice, it's almost the ideal setup for this sort of question. We had a site here in Olifants West, and this is included in that APNR area that Mike Peel was talking about, where there's been a big increase in elephants. And there's no absence of them there, but we used the site nearby at Southern Cross School in Hoedspruit, where it's very similar ecology and soils and climate, but no elephants. And then a third site down at the South African Wildlife College, where the fenced area of the college provides an exclusion of elephants, although it excludes all other herbivores as well, so it's not ideal. Right, so that's just an illustration of the Letaba site. So that partial is keeping out elephants, although it also keeps out giraffe. And then at the Wildlife College, you can't really see the fence there, but there's a much higher density of woody plants inside the fenced area. Okay, so these were lots of small permanent plots, 5-meter radius, and inside that we tagged all individual trees that were taller than 30 centimeters. We also looked at taller trees further away. And then each year we go and check if all the trees are there, if they've been damaged, if they're still alive, and for a subset, we measure them to get growth rates. We also do clipping of grass for grass biomass, and we have rainfall stations at each site. We also count seedlings and individuals less than 30 centimeters tall, and I just wanted to put this up to show that these are actual seedlings, so not just short plants, but ones that germinated in that particular year. Okay, so precipitation across the sites is kind of around the 500 mils a year mark. So these are all semi-arid systems. Fire is mostly absent. It's completely absent at some sites. But what I wanted to show you here is that the data I'm presenting today encapsulate this pretty severe drought that happened between 2015 and 2019. So we have data showing a loss of tall trees from these plots, but I'm not going to present that because it's really just, there's so much data on that. It's pretty clear that that's happening everywhere. But I want to focus rather on the shrubs, the species that cause bush encroachment. So at these sites, there's a range of species that are common bush encroachment species in the region. I've included mopane trees as a shrub for this particular study. Mopanes can obviously be tall trees as well, but at that Letaba site, they exist mostly as shrubs. And they are the dominant species there by far. At the other sites, it's a mix of things like sicklebush, grevias, particularly grevia bicolor, and some shorter acacias, Acacia exuvialis, our most common one. So looking at growth rates, there's a very clear effect of elephants. So plots that are exposed to elephants have negative growth rates for the shrubs. They are getting shorter on average each year, whereas those protected from elephants are growing, albeit slowly, only about 5 centimeters a year, but are getting taller. So elephants are clearly feeding regularly on the shrubs at these sites. That doesn't mean much, though, in terms of bush encroachment. I mean, elephants might just convert a tall shrubland to a short shrubland, but if the density hasn't changed, that doesn't really have much significance for overall woody cover. The shrubs actually have to die if you're going to regulate tree cover in the long term. So in terms of mortality, at the Letaba site, there's absolutely no effect and the mortality rate. So this is the fraction of tagged trees that survive from 1 year to, or that die from 1 year to the next. And there's really no, often the mortality is higher where there's elephants. The other sites, though, seem to have higher mortality in most years. It's quite variable, but on average, and this is statistically significant with a mixed effects linear model, mortality is higher at plots exposed to elephants. Looking at that mortality data in a different way, this is just for individual trees, and I've categorized them according to whether they have ever had elephant damage on an individual or not over the course of the study. And at least at this site, those that had been damaged were more likely to die. Only a weak effect at the college, and the masochistic Mopanis actually seemed to enjoy being damaged. The mortality was 0. Interestingly, that severe drought that occurred through the middle of the study had very little, actually no impact on mortality. Although at Letaba, it seemed to be have some. Okay, then moving on to recruitment. So even if elephants aren't causing much mortality or cause limited mortality, they could also have a very long-term effect if they restrict recruitment, because the shrubs would eventually die from something, and if there's no recruitment, then less shrubs. And here the data is very messy. The emergence of seedlings is very variable from year to year and spatially patchy as well. And there's not any clear effects here. So at Letaba, we had a massive recruitment event of Mopani seedlings in 1 year, which interestingly was in the middle of the drought. But that's really just, the data is far too messy to make any conclusive conclusions. It does seem, though, at our plots where there are elephants, that recruitment in the last few years has been consistently low. And that is not necessarily the case for the plots protected from elephants. Just as an aside, one of the big, other than rainfall, one of the big determinants, it seems, of seedlings emergence is the amount of herbaceous biomass. So only in plots that had low biomass in a particular year did we get really large numbers of seedlings. And so there might be scope for an indirect effect of elephant here if elephants ultimately increase grass cover by reducing competition from shrubs, then that might ultimately restrict shrub recruitment and you get a feedback effect. And so that might be a longer term process that emerges from this experiment. Okay, so the ultimate question is density. The balance of mortality and recruitment, is that actually leading to a lower density of shrubs at these plots? And the answer is no, not yet, but it is clearly preventing an increase. So at Letaba, there's really no effect at all with those Mopanis. They just seem to be invincible. At Olifants West, the plots exposed to elephants have maintained a constant density, whereas the site where there's no elephants seems to be undergoing bush encroachment. There's been some really big increases. And then at the Wildlife College as well, there's been increases in the control area where it's been more or less flat and maybe even starting to come down with elephants. So some preliminary evidence that this could be happening. So just to conclude then, elephants do seem to be at least regulating the density of shrubs in this part of the world, possibly going to be reducing it in the future. It doesn't seem to hold for Mopani felts, although we only have one Mopani felt site. I think Mopanis are just really well adapted to elephants, and that might explain their dominance in certain parts of Southern Africa. It does seem likely that as elephant numbers are growing and as droughts are predicted to become more severe, that elephants will actually start reducing the density of shrubs. And so I think we're heading for a very open system in the central Lowveld and Greater Kruger. The tall trees are pretty much on their way out, and I think the shrubs will follow in many areas. So I think we're heading for a much more open grassy system. And I think then it is plausible that a lack of elephants in the past from excessive hunting was a big factor in driving bush encroachment, at least in some parts of the region. And that's it, thanks.
Thank you, Tony, finishing under time. Do we have a question for Tony? Michelle?
Thanks, Tony. Very interesting presentation. You mentioned that Mopani felt is, or Mopani are behaving differently to the other species, but in your other sites, are you seeing species-specific differences I mean, I don't know if you looked at that, but just also what's your feeling?
Yeah, so I haven't looked at that in detail yet, but from what I have looked at briefly, it's not really evident. So there's not enough, we've only got enough replicates of the most common species, so I can only talk about a couple of species, but they all seem to be fairly similar in their resilience. Yeah, I think the drought damage interaction is where we might see some differences. Yeah, but there's also you get into very sort of fine scale landscape effects. So like a certain species growing lower down on the slope is going to behave differently to up there. So it's quite hard to tease it all out. Yeah.
Good, thank you very much, Tony.
Thanks.
Right. My other reminder, there's only one piece of paper in this box. I haven't looked at who the victim is on that piece of paper, but please keep your eyes peeled for faux pas nominations. So we have a few to read out this evening at our gala dinner. The box is right here in the corner. Right, our final presentation for this morning is Moleseng Moshobane, also from SAON. And something I feel is very fitting for this 60th symposium is he's going to be giving us an overview of the landscape of research published in our journal from 2008 to 2025. Thank you. Please come and join us.
No, it's fine.
Are you happy with this? Okay. We do need you just to speak into the mic though, so that the online audience can hear.
And the monitor?
The monitor's here. Maybe we should do this mic rather. There we are. This way. I shall do so. There we go.
Good morning. Today I'll be speaking to you today under the title that says Landscape of Research, that was published in the African Journal of Range and Forage Science. Now, before I go into what I'm going to talk about, there's a way that I want to start with. For those who are aware on how I always start this kind of presentation, forgive me for a repeated joke, it's an insult. But today, I'm in business, it's no longer about jokes. Now, but before I go into what I want to talk about, I want to move things out of the way, which is very key to what I want to talk about. The first thing is, I have to be relevant. It's GSSA. Now, this is the only species that you are going to see throughout my entire presentation. And this is Paspalam genoram. And those are the two other species that are alien to South Africa, that are alien to South Africa, then we were recently detected in various provinces across South Africa. But this is enough about species. You're no longer going to hear the word species throughout my presentation. Now, when I started my first job, my first supervisor told me that it's not always good to present pie charts in science. You must look for other sophisticated means to present your research. Until that has been 10 years ago, until last night, I've been trying to figure out the best way to present my data. And throughout my presentation, these are the kind of graphs that you are going to see. Now, before I go into the nitty-gritties of what I want to talk about, there's a singer by the name of Gina Riley that she likes. The song says, "It is what it is when it is." So if you find something disconcerting and you find something that looks odd here and there, just know it is what it is. Now, this kind of study that I've conducted is bibliometrics, but within bibliometrics, there are many key terminologies, but today I want to talk about two. The first one is bibliometrics, which is the application of mathematical and statistical method to publication. The second one is scientometrics. Yeah. After posing for the picture, I talk about scientometrics, which is the science of measuring the quality of science. In a nutshell, I would say is the science of science. Now, in this kind of study, there are many applications, but I want to talk about three, which is the
whereby we study the trends in the research production. Secondly, we identify the key authors or the main producers of this knowledge. And secondly, you could also identify the past, current trends, and also the major themes that do come out from these kind of studies. Now, for the purpose of my study, I selected the African Journal of Forage Science, and I wouldn't want to go into the history because the previous speakers, I think it's Gina, spoke about a similar study, and also there's another study that was done by Sue Milton that also looked at this. But in my talk, I'm only going to talk about the publication trends, the authorship patterns, the institutions, and the key themes that emerged between this study period. And in order to do this, there are various applications that I've used. Some of the popular ones is R, BibSite, HistSite, Explorer, and another plethora of other applications that we could use. Now, what have we found? This is what we found. Between the study period, we found that there were 498 articles that were produced, and these were produced by about 1,304 authors, and there was a growth rate of 1.13%. Now, within that period, here we are looking at the knowledge production from the point where we started this review and up to the year 2024. You could see that there was a bit low knowledge production until just after COVID, which the logical explanation of that is that lockdown did have effect. But in this case, it was slightly different. Scholars or authors, researchers were no longer going to the field. They sat in their rooms. They had to go back to the old, files to look for manuscripts and so on. And those manuscripts are reflected in this case. The second part I looked at is citations. So there's what we call citation half-life. That means a publication that is published this year would need to wait at least 2 years to begin to receive the citations. But one of the things that I can point out is the impact of special issues. While you're looking at the spikes here, if you go into the full range of articles, you realize that there were several special issues that came out in this period, and special issues tend to also affect the citation numbers. Now, the next thing that I'm talking about here is the main contributing authors. This is the list is endless. The list, these many authors, like I said, 1,304, but I'm only mentioning a few of them. If you see your name, good, but if you don't, there's another space in this side going forward. There are many, many authors involved here. So I didn't leave anyone out, but yes. Now, here are the main contributing institutions. What you're looking at is the top contributing institutions that have contributed to most of those studies. As we can see, KZN, UCT, Stellenbosch University, and so on. I hear somebody says, but the logo for Stellenbosch is put upside down. It's not a mistake. It's for a purpose. The reason I put it here is to emphasize a point that there are people who write in their manuscript, they write Stellenbosch University. Sometimes they write University of Stellenbosch. So when you are doing this kind of study, it reads that as two different institutions. But I had to go down individually into each and every paper to combine papers where there were some discrepancies in terms of the institutions. Thank you for that thought. Now, I went further and looked at the main corresponding authors from those manuscripts. Now, we can see that South Africa had many of those corresponding authors were coming from South Africa, but we went a step further and looked at the nationalities within this manuscript that were published. There is what we call single country authorship and multiple country authorships. So what you are looking at here in red is multiple country authorships, and then the blue or green is the single country authorships. Now, what you are looking at here again is the collaboration between South Africa and other countries. So you can see the band, the strength or the width of the band here indicates the strength or the number of publications that were done between these two countries. So you could see there's a strong relationship between between America and Australia and a couple of other countries here in the global north. Now, this is another way to look at the collaboration between countries. So like I said, the band here indicates more or less the same thing that I've spoken about, which is the number of publication between the collaboration between those countries. Now, again, this is another way of looking at it. You could see this band, which is red, mainly this cluster is South Africa and USA and Australia. That's where there are many collaborations or many papers within this cluster. Now, a study that was done by Adams, he said that by the year American Journal of Ecology, there were 60% of single-authored or single-country papers, but he estimated that today, at the time the study was done, not today, the 24th, but the time that the study was done, it was only 4%. But he further estimated that the best science tend to come from international collaborations. And Price also said the proportion of multi-authored papers has accelerated. And if it continues, we are likely to see the extinction of single-authored papers. Now, the other paper also said that the meaningful international collaboration can end what they call helicopter research. In this paper, they said instead of authors from global north flying in, collecting samples, leaving, scientists should treat local people as partners and think fair instead of charitable, but think fair instead of charitable when it comes to authorship. So in this case, I have a problem with the word helicopter research. It's also named parachute research. I mean, I don't understand. Do we really think these guys come like this? They don't come like this. Instead, they come like this. Maybe we need to change the name to something, research. Not Lufthansa, but something else. Now, these were the main keywords that emerged from the study. I mean, I don't need to go into details because the depth here also shows that the main papers focused on vegetation management and rainfall. Of course, the other keywords that are also in the periphery also indicates that there were fewer studies that looked at this. Now, this is the same as what you have seen before, but I wanted to show the cluster between the different studies that looked at various aspects of the study. You can see that always nutrition, quality, livestock is also one cluster, but you can see that vegetation tends to be at the center or at the core of most of those studies that were done. Of course, it makes sense that livestock feed on plant, and that is vegetation. So no wonder vegetation is seen as I've shown. But here is another way of looking at that. You could see that vegetation always occurs closely with vegetation management, dynamics, and diversity. So those terminologies tends to occur closer to one another. Now, I'm going to skip a few things in the interest of time. So what I can show here is that there were fewer studies that looked at overgrazing in the early 2009, but we see overgrazing emerging. And around 2015, we start to see other key terminologies such as remote sensing that started to pop up. And there were many papers on remote sensing that around the year 2018 going forward. So this is just the thematic evolution, how the themes were before in 2008 and up to now, how they have changed. But I'm looking at the screen here. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip a few other things, but I can indicate things like remote sensing, which started appearing at this period, which I've already mentioned. But we see other themes or other themes that it disappeared and other themes started emerging. Now, I'm going to skip this for one of reasons other than time, because I wanted to present this very meticulously, but I realized the word tripartite, it always takes me to tripartite alliance. So I don't want to sound political. I leave that one out. Now, this is the interesting part. The who's who, who's working with who. I'm not going to go into detail because I was told in science they should be under control. For instance, we can see our former president here with Scoggins, which means, there's evidence that these two work together. So if this is correct, the rest of the connections should be correct. Now, I see here that my time is up, but I'm going to conclude with the title of this paper that says, 1 is the lowliest number. So in the interest of time, I'm going to leave this part out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do not run away just yet. I never expected to be so entertained and just transfixed by bibliometrics. Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. Is there one question before we break for tea? I think they're speechless. Thank you so much. That was such a great way to finish off this session.